Blind police officer and his K9 were mocked, but what happened next left everyone in shock. The packed courtroom hummed with low murmurs and barely concealed whispers. The air was thick with skepticism, a silent yet powerful force pressing down on the man stepping through the heavy wooden doors. Officer Daniel Carter, his posture firm and unwavering, walked forward, guided by the steady presence at his side, Shadow, his highly trained German shepherd. The dog's ears twitched, sensing the tension that filled the space. His sharp eyes darted around, scanning the room like a seasoned officer, even as Daniel kept his head high. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, raised an eyebrow as he watched the blind officer take his place. A few defense lawyers exchanged amused glances. Some officers in the back smirked, and a quiet chuckle rippled through the courtroom. "Unbelievable," someone muttered under their breath. Daniel heard it. He heard all of it. He didn't flinch. Despite the doubtful stares and whispered mockery, Daniel moved with confidence, unshaken by the judgment around him. Shadow walked beside him like a silent guardian, his body tense yet controlled, every muscle primed for action. He wasn't just a guide dog. He was Daniel's partner, protector, and eyes in a world of darkness. Flashbacks flickered through Daniel's mind. The moment he first held Shadow's leash, feeling the power and intelligence in the dog. The grueling months of training, where they learned to trust each other without question. The first time Shadow led him through a dangerous situation, his instincts flawless, his loyalty absolute. Now, standing before a sea of doubters, Daniel knew one thing with certainty: Shadow would never fail him. A murmur spread through the room. "How can a blind cop testify?" one lawyer whispered. "This is a joke, right?" an officer muttered to his colleague. Even the judge couldn't hide his skepticism. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with doubt. "Officer Carter, you do realize this is a court of law, don't you? How exactly do you plan to serve justice when you can't even see?" Laughter rippled through a few spectators. The smirks, the shaking heads. Daniel could feel them all, even if he couldn't see them. Shadow, sensing his partner's tension, let out a quiet but firm growl. The laughter faded. The room was waiting for Daniel to crumble, to stammer, to walk away. Instead, he stood his ground. "I lost my sight," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But I never lost my purpose." A flashback unfolded in his mind. A cold night, a dangerous drug bust gone wrong. Gunfire erupted, chaos filled the air. Daniel, in the line of duty, took a bullet that changed his life forever. When he woke up in the hospital, the world was dark. They told him his career was over, that he'd never serve again. But then came Shadow, and everything changed. The dog wasn't just trained to guide, he was trained to think, react, protect. Together, they became something more than a man and his K9. They became a team. No. One saw coming. The judge scoffed, shaking his head. "A blind cop, how can you possibly serve justice?" A fresh wave of snickers followed. Daniel heard a few murmured words. Liability, unreliable, just retire. But Daniel, he didn't break. Shadow, standing tall at his side, flicked his ears forward, his nose twitching as if he could sense the challenge ahead. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. "Let's move on. What's the case?" The prosecution lawyer stood. "Your Honor, we are here today regarding a high-profile case. A notorious gang leader, Vincent Reyes, is on trial, but the most crucial evidence is missing." A collective hush fell over the courtroom. If the evidence wasn't found, Reyes would walk free, and everyone in that room knew it. That's when Daniel spoke. "Your Honor, Shadow and I found something during the investigation, something that changes everything." The defense lawyer scoffed, arms crossed. "Oh, really? And how does a blind officer find evidence?" More chuckles. The skepticism thickened. Daniel didn't react, but Shadow did. The dog let out a low, rumbling growl, his body stiffening. Something was wrong. The judge hesitated. He looked from Daniel to Shadow, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. The defense lawyer smirked, shaking his head. "This is absurd. How can a man who can't even see testify about what happened?" Daniel clenched his jaw. Because I don't need eyes to see the truth. At that moment, Shadow growled again, louder this time. His gaze locked onto someone in the room. The courtroom froze. The suspect's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. Shadow's eyes never left him. A chilling silence fell over the room. What did Shadow sense? Daniel's pulse quickened. He placed a hand gently on Shadow's head, feeling the tension in the dog's body. Then, in a voice steady as steel, Daniel said, "Shadow never reacts without reason." The once skeptical judge leaned forward, his gaze narrowing. "Officer Carter," he said slowly, "what exactly does your dog know that we don't?" The answer would change everything. The courtroom was suffocating with tension. Every seat was filled. Reporters scribbled notes. Officers stood against the walls, and the public leaned forward, eager for the verdict. At the center of it all sat Vincent Reyes, a notorious gang leader. He was known for his cruelty, his empire built on fear. And yet today he looked almost amused. The judge rubbed his temples, frustration evident on his face. The prosecution had failed to present undeniable evidence. Without it, the case was slipping away. The defense lawyer smirked, glancing at his client. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "it's clear we lack sufficient proof. My client should not have to suffer through baseless accusations." The judge exhaled heavily. He was considering it. Reyes was about to walk free. Then a voice cut through the tension. "Your Honor, we have the evidence you need." The room shifted. All eyes turned toward Officer Daniel Carter. He stood tall, his face unreadable behind dark glasses. At his side, Shadow sat alert, unwavering. The defense lawyer snorted. "Oh, and how exactly do you know that, Officer Carter?" His words dripped with mockery. "I hate to state the obvious, but you are blind." Laughter rippled through the room. A few officers exchanged glances, their disbelief evident. The prosecutor hesitated. He had doubts too, but Daniel didn't waver. "Shadow and I found something during our investigation," he said firmly. "Something that will change this case." The judge studied him carefully. He wasn't convinced yet, but he was listening. The scene flashed back to a stormy night just days earlier. Daniel and Shadow were out in the field, trailing a lead in the city's most dangerous district. The alleys were pitch black, shadows stretching like traps. Most officers would have hesitated, but Daniel relied on Shadow's instincts, not his sight. "Find him, boy," Daniel whispered. Shadow's nose twitched. He moved forward, guiding Daniel with precise, deliberate steps. Then, a sudden noise. A gunshot rang out, shattering the silence. Daniel ducked, his grip tightening on Shadow's harness. Footsteps pounded in the distance. They ran. Through rain-soaked streets, past abandoned warehouses. The scent of danger was thick in the air, but Shadow pushed forward. Then, he stopped. His body stiffened. He had found something. Daniel reached out, his fingers grazing cold metal. It was a gun, recently fired. Evidence. But it wasn't just the gun. Near it, tucked behind a dumpster, Shadow's nose pressed against a discarded piece of fabric, a jacket. Daniel felt the stitching, a symbol, one he recognized. Back in the courtroom, the defense lawyer leaned forward, grinning. "So let me get this straight," he said. "You're telling us that, in the dead of night, in an alley full of trash, you, a blind man, found key evidence?" The laughter returned. "How did you even know what you were holding?" the lawyer continued, shaking his head. "Or are we supposed to believe the dog whispered it to you?" A few people chuckled. The judge remained silent. Daniel didn't react, but Shadow did. A low growl rumbled from Shadow's throat. It was deep, unmistakable, and it was directed at someone in the room. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Daniel's heart pounded. He could feel the tension in Shadow's posture. His partner wasn't just alert, he was locked onto something. Or someone. The defense lawyer shifted uneasily. "Control your dog," he snapped. But Shadow's stare didn't waver. The judge frowned, looking from Shadow to Daniel. "Officer Carter, does your dog often react like this?" "No," Daniel said simply. His voice was firm, certain, not without reason. A ripple of uncertainty spread through the room. Then, a realization struck Daniel like lightning. Shadow wasn't growling at Vincent Reyes. He was growling at someone sitting just a few feet away. The prosecutor's assistant. The young man froze under the weight of Shadow's gaze. His breathing quickened. Daniel's pulse raced. He remembered the jacket, the symbol embroidered into the fabric. It belonged to someone on the inside, someone helping Reyes from within. The room was holding its breath. Daniel took a step forward, trusting Shadow's instincts. "You were there that night," he said, turning toward the assistant. "Weren't you?" The young man flinched. What?" "You're the missing link," Daniel continued. "The jacket, the evidence we found, it was yours." A sharp gasp from the prosecution table. The judge's expression darkened. "Is this true?" The assistant stammered, his face pale. Then he bolted from his chair, but Shadow was faster. With a powerful lunge, the German Shepherd blocked his escape, his bared teeth stopping the man in his tracks. The courtroom exploded into chaos. "Restrain him!" the judge barked. Officers rushed in, pinning the assistant down. The defense lawyer's face drained of color. Reyes himself looked stunned. Shadow sat beside Daniel, ears pricked, tail still. He had done his job. The judge turned to Daniel, his gaze lingering on Shadow. "For years I doubted your place in this courtroom, Officer Carter," he said, voice heavy with realization. "I won't make that mistake again." The room was silent now, not out of doubt but respect. Justice had found its way through the darkness, and a blind officer, with his K9 by his side, had proved that sight wasn't needed to see the truth. The courtroom was frozen in silence. Every eye was on Daniel Carter and his K9 Shadow. The judge leaned forward, his fingers intertwined, skepticism still evident in his expression. "Officer Carter," he said slowly, "you claim your dog has an instinct for uncovering the truth. Very well, prove it." The defense lawyer chuckled, crossing his arms. "This ought to be good." Daniel didn't hesitate. He squared his shoulders. "Shadow, search." A command spoken with complete trust. The air was thick with anticipation. People held their breath. Would this so-called blind cop actually deliver? Shadow's ears twitched, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Then he moved, slow, deliberate, nose to the ground, weaving between tables and chairs. The tension in the room was unbearable. The defense lawyer smirked. "This is ridiculous. What's he even looking for?" Shadow ignored him. His instincts were razor-sharp. Then he stopped. A stiffened tail, a low growl, his paws frozen. He was locked onto something. Right in front of the defense table. The murmurs grew louder. People shifted in their seats. "What is it, Shadow?" Daniel asked. Shadow scratched at the floor, once, twice. Then he let out a sharp bark. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Officer Carter, what is your dog indicating?" Daniel's fingers brushed the table's edge. He felt a slight groove beneath, something hidden. A bailiff stepped forward, reaching under the table, and froze. "There's something here," he muttered. His hand emerged, gripping a small compartment door. A moment later, he pulled out a single black glove. Stained. With blood, gasps erupted. The courtroom was in shock. The judge leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Explain this." A forensic officer hurried over. He examined the glove, then turned pale. "This blood, it's the victim's." A heavy silence fell over the room. The defense lawyer's smirk vanished. The case wasn't just turning, it was unraveling. The judge exhaled. His fingers tightened around his gavel. For weeks, he had doubted Daniel, mocked him, questioned his ability to serve. But now it was clear. Daniel hadn't just proven his own worth, he had proven Shadow's too. He looked down at the officer and his dog, his voice steady. "I was wrong about you, Officer Carter." Daniel nodded. Once, Shadow was never wrong. For the first time, the judge truly believed that. But before the judge could issue a ruling, chaos erupted. A sharp clatter, a chair scraping against the floor. Then, a flash of metal. One of Reyes's men had drawn a weapon. His target, Daniel. Everything slowed. The gun rose, a cold glint under the fluorescent lights. Someone screamed. The judge's face twisted in shock. Daniel heard the shift in movement, the rush of air as the gun was raised, but he didn't move. He didn't have to, because Shadow did. The German shepherd lunged, a blur of fur and muscle, fangs flashing. The attacker barely had time to react before Shadow's jaws clamped onto his wrist. The gun clattered to the ground, spinning across the floor. A sharp yelp of pain. The man struggled, but Shadow held firm, his growl thunderous. Officers rushed. Forward, weapons drawn. Freeze! Another gang member tried to run, but officers tackled him before he made it to the exit. Within seconds, the danger was over. The courtroom was silent once more, but this time it was a different kind of silence, one filled with awe. Daniel reached down, his fingers brushing Shadow's head. The dog's fur was warm beneath his touch, steady, solid. Shadow had saved him, just as he always did. The judge looked over the courtroom, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces. Then he turned back to Daniel. You and your K9 have done more for justice today than most officers do in a lifetime. His voice carried weight, respect. The court owes you an apology, he said, and our gratitude. Daniel said nothing. He simply rested his hand on Shadow's back. Because the truth was clear now. He didn't need sight to serve justice. He just needed Shadow, and together they were unstoppable. For a moment, absolute silence filled the courtroom. Then applause erupted. It started with a single clap, hesitant, unsure, then another, and another. Soon the entire room was on its feet. The same people who had mocked Daniel and Shadow now looked at them with nothing but respect. The once skeptical officers nodded. The same lawyers who had smirked in amusement now watched in Tavokumas. Even the judge himself stood, his gaze steady, filled with something Daniel never expected to see: admiration. Daniel reached down, feeling the soft fur of his loyal companion. Shadow stood tall, ears perked, his tail giving the slightest wag. They had done it. The judge took a deep breath and turned to the courtroom. This case has taken an unexpected turn, he said, his voice carrying the weight of his newfound respect. He shifted his gaze to the defense table, his eyes narrowing. Based on the evidence provided by Officer Carter and his K9, the court finds the defendant guilty. A heavy gavel strike echoed through the room. A sigh of relief swept across the prosecution team. Some even exchanged approving nods with Daniel. He had done what no one believed possible. He had solved a case without sight, but with clarity, beyond vision. The defendant slumped in his seat, his face pale. He had underestimated a blind officer, and that had been his greatest mistake. Daniel exhaled, the tension finally leaving his body. He knelt beside Shadow, running his hand through the loyal dog's fur. "We did it, buddy," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Shadow turned to him, his intelligent eyes shining with understanding. A soft whine, a wag of his tail. In that moment, no words were needed. They had fought this battle together, and won. A throat cleared. Daniel turned his head as the judge stepped forward, hesitation in his voice. "Officer Carter," he said, pausing as if choosing his words carefully. Then he did something no one expected. "I owe you an apology." A hush fell over the room. The same man who had once doubted, questioned, and even mocked Daniel was now standing before him with genuine humility. "You have shown us all today," the judge continued, "that true vision comes from within." The weight of his words settled over the room. Daniel nodded once, accepting the apology not with words but with grace, because in the end, proving them wrong was enough. The officers who once whispered behind Daniel's back now stood in respect. Some even saluted him. The defense lawyers, who had once laughed in amusement, now exchanged glances, their expressions serious. They had spent the entire case questioning him. Now they only had one question left. How could they have ever doubted him? This case was never just about justice. It was about the bond between a man and his dog. Shadow had proven that loyalty, intelligence, and instinct were far more valuable than mere sight. And Daniel? He had proven that true strength came not from what he had lost, but from what he refused to give up. They were more than just partners. They were a team. As Daniel and Shadow stepped out of the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter. The weight of doubt, the whispers, the skepticism, the judgment was gone. Now the world saw them not as an odd pair, but as heroes. Among the crowd, a young aspiring officer stood at attention, watching Daniel with wide eyes, inspired. Because today he had learned something far more valuable than any lesson in training. Strength wasn't about what you could see. It was about what you believed. And as Daniel and Shadow walked away side by side, the moment lingered. A moment that would never be forgotten. Because courage isn't about sight. It's about faith, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog. And that is what true strength looks like.